Okay, continuing on with objections to utilitarianism, we just have two more to cover in this list: the conflict with rights and that utilitarianism doesn't consider persons or deserts. The conflict with rights is one of the biggest objections to utilitarianism and probably one of the most serious ones, one of the hardest for utilitarians to answer. So here is an example. Simple example, seatbelt laws. Seatbelts definitely prevent deaths in car crashes. Helmets for motorcycles is the same way. They definitely lower the rates of death and serious injury in motorcycle crashes. But they also place restrictions on individuals' rights. With seatbelt laws, an individual who gets in their car and doesn't put on their seatbelt and drives down the road can be stopped and fined for not wearing a seatbelt. So the seatbelt law is a kind of restriction on their freedom, right? Likewise with motorcycle helmets. The law generates greater utility, but it impedes the rights or the freedoms of the individuals who are subject to the law. And so if you think that the freedoms are actually better than the utility gained, then you think that the utility gained isn't a good enough reason for instituting those laws. And so what we have here is a kind of trade-off between greater utility and greater personal freedom. And some people would say that the personal freedom is valuable even if it comes at a cost in utility. And the problem for utilitarianism is that utilitarianism only recognizes utility as the standard for right and wrong. It doesn't recognize like freedom or rights as something that themselves need to be preserved in our action. Another example of this that you may have already been thinking of since I used the example of seatbelts is say like mask laws in the time of coronavirus. Say that the law is that one has to wear a mask in public. That is imposing a restriction on individuals' freedom. To take yet another example that again you may have thought of, gun laws. So suppose that there's very good data, which in what I've looked at it, I personally think that there is very good data in support of this. But even if you don't think there is, just assume for the moment that there is, because it's necessary to make the point. So suppose that there's very good data that restricting access to firearms by making like certain kinds of firearms illegal and increasing the severity of background checks and limiting the amount of guns that an individual can own and things like that. Okay, passing much more severe gun laws than what we currently have. Suppose there's very good evidence that passing those laws, passing those restrictions, would seriously reduce the rate of death and injury by gunshot in the United States. And so overall, passing those laws, there's very good argument that it would increase the overall utility, the overall positive utility, and decrease the negative utility. Okay, so that the total utility generated by harsher gun laws is much greater than the total utility generated by allowing things to be as they are with access to guns and so on. Even if that were true, a lot of gun rights activists would say, yeah, but it's my right to own a gun and it's other Americans' right to own a gun. And the freedom to have a gun, the right to have a gun, is more important than the utility that's gained from outlawing guns. Okay, so if you think an argument like that can work, you can, by the way, okay, yet another example. Think about privacy. Okay, so some people would say, look, it's even if the government having access to all of our private information would make us safer because they'd be able to identify terrorists more quickly, and maybe even if that access from the government would allow for a much higher utility, still the cost to individual freedom is too great. And so even if the utility would be greater from having more invasion of privacy, the invasion of privacy itself is a cost to individual rights, individual freedoms, and that cost is not worth it, okay? If you believe any of these arguments in favor of freedom over utility work, then you are recognizing that there's something that's valuable besides just utility. There's something that should be part of our ethical deliberations besides just utility, and we can call that thing rights or individual freedoms. And the problem for utilitarianism is it doesn't include those elements in its basic ethical guidelines. And this same point can also be made with some more extreme examples. So, for instance, say that there is a society. This case is sometimes called the scapegoat case. Say that there's a society where there's a lottery in place. Shirley Jackson has a short story called The Lottery, which some people read in high school. You may have read it before. You can find it easily online. It describes a lottery of this kind. And the movie The Hunger Games also has a lottery of this kind, okay? Slightly different in some ways. But the basic idea is everybody gets a number in this small society, we'll say of 100 people. And one person out of the 100 will be basically tortured and killed in this example, okay? So out of the 100, one person will be scapegoated, will just be treated as a demon or a guilty of terrible crimes, and will be beaten, tortured, and killed. And say that there is evidence that having this practice in this society, that this happens once every 10 years, say, it tends to reduce crime in the society as a whole, or it tends to reduce kind of social unrest in the society as a whole. That was kind of the justification in The Hunger Games, if you've seen those movies or read those books. But suppose that this lottery, there's very good evidence that it reduces social unrest, and it therefore generates a slight increase in positive utility for all members of the society, except for the one out of 100 who is picked for the scapegoating. Okay, so the one person out of 100 who's picked for scapegoating is going to get a negative 100 utility, and the other 2 to 100 people in the society are going to get a +4 positive utility. And so that generates a net total utility of 296. And if we compare that scenario with a scenario where there is no lottery, then everyone will just will only have like a level 1 utility. Okay, so we'll just say nobody gets the benefit of the lottery, the utility benefit of the lottery, and nobody has to pay the cost. Well, the point of this case is that it seems like the principle of utility would recommend instituting the lottery, whereas when we look at this case, I think most of us would say, no, the lottery is bad, it's wrong. It's much better to have a society that doesn't have a lottery like that than it is to have a society that has a lottery like that. Very few people are convinced that if a lottery like this generated greater overall utility, that it would be a good thing for a society to institute it. Most people think a lottery like this sounds horrible and unfair, not to be preferred to the alternative. And if you ask yourself why you think that this is wrong, if you do think that it's wrong to have a lottery like this, you probably will ultimately end up saying something like this, that the 99 people in the society have no right to take the life of that one person. Another way to put it would be, it's not fair that that one person has to suffer in order for the other 99 to benefit. Yet another way to put it is to say that that person doesn't deserve to be punished or treated in that way. And yet another way is to say that they have a right not to be treated and punished in that way. They have a right not to be tortured and killed. And so even if it's generates more utility to torture and kill them, still it's wrong to torture and kill them because that one person, has a right not to be treated in that way. Now, if you talk in those ways, though, if that's your explanation for why the lottery is a bad thing, you've already broken with utilitarianism in a way. You've already stopped being a utilitarian, it seems like, because now you're appealing to something that utilitarianism's main ethical guideline, the principle of utility, doesn't make any mention of. You're talking about people's rights and what's fair and what they deserve. And these are not things that the principle of utility directly includes. So it seems like the principle of utility recommends the lottery, but we tend to think that the lottery is morally wrong. And one of the reasons we have for thinking it's morally wrong is that it does not include a consideration of people's rights, of what is fair, and of what people deserve. And those are all concepts that are really kind of outside of the universe of considerations that utilitarianism brings to thinking about ethics. Here's another case that makes basically the same point. So imagine that a person goes in for a routine operation to the hospital, and this person is not, it just so happens this person is not extremely popular or accomplished. They don't have a lot of friends. You know, their mother loves them, but you know, they don't make that much of an impact on anybody else's lives. And say that this person is going in for just a standard kind of surgery that usually doesn't have any complications or kill anybody and so on. And at the same time, it just so happens that in this hospital, there are 5 world-class philanthropists. These are people who save hundreds of people's lives a month with the work that they do, the charitable work they do around the world, okay? And so the question is, and it just so happens that each of these philanthropists that's in the hospital needs an organ. So one of them needs a kidney, one of them needs a liver, one of them needs a heart, and so on, in order to survive. And these organs are not going to come from anywhere. It seems there aren't enough to go around. And so these philanthropists are on their deathbeds, they're about to die. The question is, should a good utilitarian doctor put the unknown person who's in the hospital just for routine operations, should they put them under and take their organs and distribute them to the philanthropists who need them and let that person die, so that the 5 philanthropists can live and can continue to do their world-class philanthropy work and save so many hundreds of lives around the world? Okay, so most of us, when we hear this case, we say, oh my God, that's horrible. Absolutely, you should not strip a person's organs who goes into the hospital just for a routine operation. And again, probably our reason for saying that, if we're pressed, if somebody's like, well, why not? You know, is we say that person has a right not to be interfered with in that way. That nobody has a right to take their organs without their permission, right? It's not. That no matter how much somebody else may need them or how much good could be done from taking them, there's some things it's just wrong to do to a person, and this is one of them. It's just wrong no matter what to take somebody's organs without their permission. Okay, so again, the reason why this case is a problem for utilitarianism is that utilitarianism says you should act in such a way as to generate maximum pleasure and minimum pain for all of those affected by your actions. And utilitarianism just sums up the pain and pleasure for all of the affected parties of the action. And what that would generate in this case, if we were to just sum up the pleasure and pain, it seems like the stripping option generates a lot more pleasure overall and a lot less pain than the not stripping option. And so it seems like utilitarianism would recommend that we should strip this person's organs. Well, how is a utilitarian going to respond to these objections about the scapegoat case and the organ stripping case? It seems like these are really strong arguments against utilitarianism. Well, there actually is a line of defense that has been developed, and it basically goes as follows. So there's sort of 2 versions of it. One is to say if you actually look closely at how much good and bad a scapegoat case or an organ stripping case will do, if you look closely at how much pleasure or pain it will generate overall, you'll always find that cases like that will generate more pain than pleasure overall. Okay, so that's a kind of Bentham style response to these objections. The problem with that reply, that's the adverse consequences reply. The problem with that reply is that it seems pretty likely that there are going to be some cases somewhere, some of the time, where violating somebody's rights or freedoms or doing something that you supposedly don't have a right to do to them actually generates more pleasure than pain overall. And so the question arises once again whether or not that's okay. And cases like the organ stripping or the scapegoat, those are cases that may be like that. Torture in times of war is another case that could be like that. It could be that by torturing an individual, you can save lots of innocent people's lives. Somebody would say it's still wrong to torture. It's just always wrong to torture anybody. But other people would say, you know, I mean, if you're going to be a strict utilitarian, you might say, no, it's worth it because it generates more utility overall. Okay. So it seems like the puzzle is still there. It's not, it seems disingenuous or a matter of self-deception or just unrealistic to say that there's never going to be a case where violating somebody's rights or freedoms can generate more utility than not violating them. Now, the other possible reply is due to Mill, and this is a distinction between act and rule utilitarianism. The way that the principle of utility was originally formulated, it seems to be a measure that we use to make decisions about every individual act that we undertake. But it's possible to formulate it slightly differently as a principle that should guide our adoption of rules. And so here is how the reply would go to, I'll take the organ stripping case because it's clear to see, but the same reply can be developed to the scapegoat case. You say, if we had as a general policy that people's organs could be stripped when it would save the lives of those who are likely to generate more positive utility in their own ongoing lives and activities. If we had that as a general policy or a maxim, you could say, that we all followed, then that general rule would have very negative consequences in utilitarian terms. For instance, people would stop going to hospitals, right? Because they'd be worried that just going to the hospital for a checkup or an operation or whatever might lead to them being killed and their organs taken. So enormous groups of people would no longer benefit from medical science and medical institutions because they would just avoid hospitals as dangerous places. The total negative utility of that consequence surely outweighs any positive utility from 5 philanthropists being saved, right? So the point again is that even if you are able to, in an individual act, sometimes get away with something like organ stripping and it generates more utility, if you adopted that organ stripping as a general rule, if you apply the standard of rule utilitarianism to the evaluation of the decision of whether or not to strip organs, then it seems clear that you should not do the organ stripping. It seems clear that the better rule to adopt is one that recognizes every individual gets to say whether or not they give up their organs for donation, okay? So incidentally, this distinction between act and rule utilitarianism allows for utilitarians to introduce concepts like rights and fairness and what people deserve into utilitarian discourse. Another way to look at that is to say that the idea of rule utilitarianism, which again was one of Bentham's innovations, one of Mill's innovations in a part of the text that we didn't read, but that rule utilitarianism introduces a little bit, a kind of sliver of a Kantian element into utilitarianism that allows us to have a conception of rights and autonomy and things like that that we can respect. in people. So it's supposed to save utilitarianism from this kind of objection. However, there is the possibility of a reply to this reply, which goes something like this. If there was just a one-off case where you were certain that you could get away with organ stripping or with scapegoating, other cases of violating individuals' rights, not as a general rule, but just as a single act that you could get away with, then why would it not be correct, according to utilitarian principles, to take that action? It seems like the whole thrust of utilitarianism, the whole kind of basic idea from which the entire theory is generated, right, is the idea of maximizing positive utility and minimizing negative utility overall. And so if you were able to do that in an individual case by stripping organs, and you knew it was a case nobody would find out about and it would have these other negative effects, then why would it be wrong to pretend like utilitarianism actually has a good answer to that? Is, according to this reply to the reply, to pretend that it has a good answer is just a lie. You know, that utilitarianism doesn't, the theory itself doesn't generate the result that our intuitive ethical thinking says is the right result here. Okay, so it seems like there's still a problem with the theory itself. And the last objection that we want to consider makes a very, very similar point, having to do with utilitarianism not considering what people deserve, or another way to put this is not considering differences between people that sometimes make it that one person deserves something whereas another person does not deserve something. And what they deserve can be like what it's fair to give them or not to give them or to take away. And it can include things like whether or not it's fair to punish them, whether or not they deserve to be punished, whether or not they deserve to reap some benefits of some kind or another. So I'm going to look at a case that helps to explain this problem. So say we have a person who has stolen another person's car, and imagine that the thief of the car is really having a great time in this new car that they stole, but the person that they stole the car from has 10 other cars in their garage. So the person that's been stolen from is a car collector, and they barely even miss this one car that they have, though they do miss it to some extent. Okay, it does hurt them that they've lost one of their cars, but the total utility generated for the person that stole the car is very high, and the total utility cost for the person that the car was stolen from is very low. Well, it seems like utilitarianism should recommend that we should just let that person who stole the car steal the car. Since more utility is generated by allowing them to have this car that they stole than forcing them to return it or preventing them from stealing it, that the stealing is actually a good thing. Now, many of us, looking at this example, probably most of us would say, whoa, that seems wrong. It's still wrong to steal something, even if it generates more utility overall, okay? And probably our reasons for saying that are that we think that the person who stole the car doesn't deserve to have the car, that they haven't earned it, or that it's not fair for them to be able to have the car, whereas the other person is the rightful owner. We might say they don't have a right to the car, whereas the person who's the rightful owner does have a right to the car. Okay, they've acquired that right by buying the car, by having the car be titled in their name, and so on. We might say that it's So anyway, the point is that something about what people deserve, that the person who owns the car deserves to get the car back, whereas the person who steals the car doesn't deserve to have the car because they haven't bought it or acquired it in the right ways. Those considerations are, again, ones that aren't included in utilitarianism itself in its principle of utility, and so it seems like there's something missing in utilitarianism. And with this one as well, utilitarians can reply by appealing to rule utilitarianism and saying that, look, even if an individual case of stealing might generate more utility overall, having a general policy of allowing stealing would generate much more negative utility than positive utility, and that's why we ought to have a rule against stealing and ought to follow that rule in our decision making. Okay, that wraps things up for the objections to utilitarianism. Quite a long set of video lectures, but hopefully helpful to you for thinking about the pros and cons of this type of ethical theory.